6 weeks sitting in a 2-room apartment with nothing to do but look out the window at the neighbors.
Window shopper.
In Rear Window, perhaps you see the best example of what Hitchcock's cinema stood for.
That's a secret private world you're looking into out there.
What are you going to do if one of them catches you?
James Stewart focuses on what's going on out there, and we're allowed to focus with him, and we all become voyeurs, and we see these various dramas unfolding.
I've seen bickering and family quarrels and mysterious trips at night, knives and saws and ropes, and now since last evening, not a sign of the wife.
The way that he was able to shoot that was just unbelievable.
You asked for something dramatically different. You got it.
It was really a masterpiece of Hitchcock's construction.
Generally, the more important the film, the worse condition the original negative and sound elements are going to be in. And Rear Window is no different than many others.
Tell me everything you saw.
Vertigo, The Man Who Knew Too Much Trouble with Harry, we realized the horrible state that all these Hitchcock pictures were in. If something really wasn't done about them, they were going to be lost forever.
If one were to ask, what are the movies of Alfred Hitchcock like? Somebody that knew nothing about movies. You could show them Rear Window and, in a sense, touch on everything in Hitchcock. You would immediately see his technical brilliance. You would see his ability to tell a story in a uniquely captivating way. You certainly have his humor.
Oh, why don't you shut up?
And thematically, you deal with voyeurism, you deal with guilt, you deal with relationships, you deal with sexuality.
We have all night.
We have all what?
Night. I'm going to stay with you.
It's all there in Rear Window.
Rear Window is sort of Hitchcock's testament film. I think it's a French term, meaning that in Rear Window, perhaps you see the best example of what Hitchcock's cinema at its best stood for, which was essentially the use of the subjective point of view. You have a shot of Jimmy Stewart, you show what he's looking at, you see his reaction. Basically, the entire movie is based on that. He looks, you see what he sees, he reacts. That is kind of the heart of Hitchcock's filmmaking. And he has an incredible ability to put you in the point of view of the leading character, or whatever character. And he does it with considerable dexterity. And it's particularly noticeable, obviously, in Rear Window, where the entire picture plays in one apartment.
You can have a man look, you can have him see something, you have him react to it. You can make him react in various ways. You see, you can make him look at one thing, look at another. Without him speaking, you can show his mind at work, comparing things. It's limitless, I would say, the power of cutting and showing the various images, the assembly of them, the juxtaposition of imagery relating to the mind of the individual.
It was really a masterpiece of Hitchcock's construction. He worked on the script with the writer, as he always did it. And the writers liked to work with him, too, because he was stimulating. His ideas were always visual, cinematic. He never took a screen credit for writing, but I'd say he contributed at least half of the plot, working out the plot.
He knew a lot about crime. He had a fascination for English crime, and in fact, one of his crime things was, and in fact, he used part of it in Rear Window, was Dr. Crippen. And this was a famous English case where he fell in love with the secretary and killed the wife and buried the wife in the backyard, and then took the secretary on a boat to get away and dressed the secretary up as a sailor. And the thing was that the captain said later on he had wondered why these two sailors were very friendly towards each other. And that's how they caught Dr. Crippen. But he loved them. He had a whole set of stories at home. Rear Window was based on a short story entitled It Had to Be Murder, published in 1942. It was written by Cornell Woolridge. His real name was, in fact, William Irish, and many of his books were made into movies. My father hired John Michael Hayes to adapt the short story. Mr. Hayes was a man of radio who had impressed my dad with his appreciation and knowledge of Shadow of a Doubt. He went on to write 4 films for my father. The screenplay of Rear Window is very different from the book. The story was transposed to Manhattan for the film. The most important element missing in the short story is the romance, which plays a major role in the film.
In the short story, it was just the Raymond Burr murdering his wife and Jimmy Stewart, watching. That was the only story. There was no Grace Kelly, there was no Thelma Ritter, there was no Miss Torso, there was no composer, there was nothing. There was just that story. So all of these little scenes, came together to make this work.
That's a secret private world you're looking into out there. People do a lot of things in private they couldn't possibly explain in public.
Like disposing of their wives.
Get that idea out of your mind. It'll only lead in the wrong direction.
What about the knife and the saw?
Did you ever own a saw?
There's that ridiculous comment about actors being cattle or whatever that is attributed to Hitchcock.
Over the couple of hundred knives you probably own in your lifetime.
Be that as it may, the performances in Rear Window from top to bottom are brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, as they were in many of Hitchcock's pictures.
Jimmy Stewart, who made quite a lot of pictures with my father loved him because Jimmy represented to the audience the ordinary man, so that a man that goes to see that picture, he can identify with Jimmy Stewart, whereas a lot of others he couldn't. Jimmy was a very sweet, kind person. And actually, there was not a lot of difference between Jimmy the actor and Jimmy the person. What you saw was what you got with him.
I had never worked with Jimmy Stewart before he came to Paramount to do Rear Window. But I found Jimmy Stewart to be a charming man, to men as well as women. He was easy to like, easy to work with, and always carried his screenplay under his arm when he wasn't actually in a scene, and always was prepared when he walked on the set. And he was the kindest man, and everybody was very fond of Jimmy Stewart. He and Hitch were like brothers. You could even occasionally see a little smile appear on Hitchcock's face when he and Jimmy were together.
He and my father got along so well, and I really think that Rear Window was one of their happiest pictures.
Who are you?
Reading from top to bottom. Lisa. Carol. Fremont.
Grace Kelly was one of the nicest people I've ever known. I think my father's feeling about Grace was she epitomized what he thought of the cool blonde with the fire beneath. She and my father were very close, and my mother, and I can remember going over on Sundays, and Grace was over, and it would all depend who she was going with at that particular time. But she was a brilliant actress, and he could just tell her in a few words, what he wanted. And she was able to give it to him. She was very, very talented.
I fell in love with her the moment I saw her on that set at Dial M for Murder. Everybody fell in love with her. Everybody fell in love with Grace Kelly, who were fortunate enough to work with her. And she was actually, I think, the most beautiful woman I ever saw in my life on film. There is a close-up of her in Rear Window. When she comes to see Jimmy, it's an introductory shot in the picture, and it's really the most beautiful shot of a woman I've ever seen in my life.
There are 2 questions that confront James Stewart's character, Jeffries, in Rear Window. One is, what's going on in his personal life? Is he going to marry Grace Kelly or not? And what's going on outside the window of his apartment, in the windows of all the apartments across the way? To some degree, to avoid looking at his own problem, he focuses on what's going on out there, and we're allowed to focus with him, and we all become voyeurs, and we see these various dramas unfolding that are all in one way or another illustrating life in relationships, for better or ill. The people that want a relationship and can't have one, Miss Lonely Hearts, the couple across the way that are fighting all the time, the newlyweds that are apparently having sex all the time. And we, meanwhile, are watching Grace Kelly come into his apartment and present the promise of a relationship that could be unbelievably good, but that he's resisting.
You mean leave the magazine?
Yes.
For what?
For yourself and me.
Jeffries, and at times other characters, use the apartments opposite as a kind of cinema screen. And they do what I think most of us do when we watch movies. They partly identify with other people. They partly compare their lives to other people's lives. They use these lives to talk about their own lives in various ways.
It's about time you got married, before you turn into a lonesome and bitter old man.
Yeah, you just see me rushing home to a hot apartment to listen to the automatic laundry and the electric dishwasher and the garbage disposal and the nagging wife.
So you could say that Stewart has a lot of different choices in the movie. You know, the original story doesn't have a love interest, but in fact that seems to be the thing that interests Hitchcock the most.
I'm not ready for marriage.
Every man's ready for marriage when the right girl comes along. And Lisa Fremont is the right girl for any man with half a brain who can get one eye open.
The scenes between Jimmy Stewart and Thelma Ritter, she was just marvelous. And she revealed a lot of the life of Jimmy Stewart in those scenes with Jimmy. You didn't know much about Jimmy Stewart until she started playing those scenes.
Look, Mr. Jeffries, I'm not an educated woman, but I can tell you one thing. When a man and a woman see each other and like each other, they ought to come together. Wham. Like a couple of taxis on Broadway.
The humor that Thelma Ritter brought to Rear Window was absolutely wonderful. And my father, he loved that because he knew that you couldn't keep going and keep going. You had to give the audience a break. You had to have them laugh at something. His whole life was the importance of having a sense of humor in whatever you do.
The thing that we all have loved about Hitchcock forever is his ability to deal with these very grim subjects, to deal with our darkest fears and emotions, but deal with them with humor.
Just where do you suppose he cut her up? Of course, the bathtub. That's the only place where he could have washed away the blood.
All the different characters were so well cast. They had Thelma Ritter, Wendell Corey, and of course Ray Burr as the murderer.
When Mr. Hitchcock started casting the picture, he left certain apartments for me to cast, and he cast the very important ones like Raymond Burr and his wife, the composer, Ross Bagdasarian, Miss Lonely Hearts, and the couple with the little dog, and left the others for me to cast. I cast them all from people that had worked with me in the past. Mr. Hitchcock said he would like to have a ballet dancer do the part of Miss Torso, but he said, I don't want her to appear as a professional ballet dancer. And he said, when you find the right person, don't you dare let her go to the dance department and rehearse or be taught steps for the scene she's going to be doing over there. I want you to give her a record of the music and let her figure out her own moves and things.
Hitchcock left the choreography up to me. You know, it's kind of like a wing it. You know, he was not very. He didn't care too much about getting everything perfect. You know, I think he liked to see a little whatever you had to do. So I remember going to a bungalow one day with the music, and Herbie Coleman, who was the assistant director, I remember saying, "Oh, I'm so scared. I don't want to do this. I need a choreographer." He said, "No, you're going to be fine."
She said, "I'm scared to death. I have the slightest idea of what to do." So I had to go over there with her and talk to her about this. I said, "I'm not going to try to tell you what ballet steps you move," but I said, "Certainly not a rehearsed kind of a step."
And I went and I fiddled around and came up with a couple of steps.
So he saw the routine and thought it was great.
What do you think?
I think Edith Head was one of the most important people that my father worked with, and he thought the same way. my father did as far as costumes in a movie was concerned, and especially with Edith Head. He felt that the costumes, color, style, everything, had to help the scene. It was all part of the feeling and the character. He didn't just say, oh, wear this, you know.
Well, if there's one thing I know, it's how to wear the proper clothes.
He and Edith worked terribly closely together on the costumes long before he really cast the picture.
Why don't I slip into something more comfortable?
By all means.
Edith Head designed all the clothes that I wore, whatever was left of them, not too much. And they painted every inch of my body every day. And I mean, I came to work the next day sometimes with still some of it left on me because I couldn't reach all the parts that they covered.
I can remember going on the set of Rear Window, and it was fascinating. I think of all the pictures that he made, that was the most fascinating set to go on, because you literally saw all the different apartments, all the different people.
Mac Johnson was the art director on Rear Window, and Mac came in and told me about this picture, and how is he going to do it? You know, he had to do this whole courtyard, and we didn't have stages that high, and so I suggested to him, Paramount, you know, wasn't a real large studio, but 2 or 3 of the stages, we stored furniture underneath. So I told Mac, I says, why don't you cut the floor out?
They were going to cut the floor out, remove everything that was in the basement, and make Jimmy Stewart's second floor room on the actual stage level. And the lawns and the first floor are going to be the basement floor.
And he said, well, they wouldn't let me do that, would they? I said, well, I bet they will for Hitchcock. And sure enough, they did. They let him.
The set went from the bottom of that basement to the grids, and that it was an enormous problem for the lighting crew, and very hot for anybody who had to work up there at the top, because we didn't have the same kind of lighting that we have today. We didn't have the same film. We didn't have the same camera lenses. So all of it conspired against us. It was really an enormous task, and the people who had to work up there took a beating, and the actors took a beating up there, too.
And in fact, we found this out from Georgine Darcy the other day, that the set was lit for 4 periods of the day.
They had for the morning, the afternoon, twilight, and then a nighttime. So they didn't have to do changing all the lights for every shot. They would just nighttime, and all the lights would change automatically. It was wonderful. It was like a little city. And there was Hitchcock. It was like a big old dollhouse that he was playing with there, you know. But it was a great set, and people came from all over the world to view it and to take pictures of it. I think it had been written up in Life or Look magazine. And then, of course, you know, we wore the little earpieces. And we could not talk back to Mr. Hitchcock, but he could talk to us. But one day, Hitchcock called me, and he said he wanted me to watch something. He was getting ready to shoot the scene of the couple on the fire escape. They had a mattress on the fire escape, and it started to rain. So he told the wife to take her earpiece out, and he gave the direction to the husband. Then he asked the husband to take his out, and he gave the direction to the wife. Now he said to me, he turned around and he winked. He said, now watch this. Now he'd given them both different directions. The husband was pulling the mattress to the one window, the wife was pulling the mattress to the other one. They were going back and forth, and they were fighting. And you could hear, and finally, he pulled the mattress, and somebody fell into the window. And it was quite funny and real. Those are the kinds of things that he would do.
One of his great talents, of course, was that he saw the film in his head and knew just where to be at every given moment. There was a reason why he was where he was. One of the great things about Hitchcock is he, you know, and most of the great directors, but Hitchcock is a notable example of a director who's always got the camera in the right place for each given moment, and it's always there for a reason. It's not there arbitrarily or just because it might be nice to shoot it from there now. And it's never decorative, and it's never just frivolous. It's always with a point and a reason. The 2 greatest schools of cinema in the silent era were the American and the German. because he was trained by the Americans and the Germans, he understood that telling a story visually was what movies were about. So you can see in all his films, he's striving to tell the story visually. So in Rear Window, I think you introduce Jimmy Stewart with, you see his broken leg, you see a broken camera, you see that he's a photographer, you see a magazine cover, etc. All done in one continuous shot, as I remember, where you are told, okay, this is what you're seeing, this is what it is, and the audience understands it as a result very quickly. That's, again, really good storytelling and what Hitchcock was particularly good at.
He had already, in his mind, made that movie. He had already drawn every single shot, so that he always said when he got on the set that it was a little boring making the picture.
Everything was in the screenplay. The cameraman knew all the time what he was expected to deliver on the film. And when Mr. Stewart would walk in the morning, the camera was usually all ready to go. The lights were set, the actors were in place, and they were all ready to go.
The way that he was able to shoot that, looking in at all the different apartments, was just unbelievable. And that's why it was so fascinating being on the set. You literally saw these apartments. I mean, they were all real. You know, people were in them. It was fascinating.
What I think is being shown here, it seems to me one of the absolutely central themes of all Hitchcock's work, and this goes right back to the British period, it goes right through the American films. The terrible incompatibility of male and female positions as they've been defined and have evolved within our culture.
According to you, people should be born, live and die on the same spot. Shut up!
The man's viewpoint is one thing, the woman's viewpoint is always another. They argue, and with all this is the idea of romantic love, what Miss Lonely Hearts is longing for, what the newlyweds were expecting, what Lisa wants. And I think Hitchcock's view of romantic love is extremely skeptical, to say the least.
What would you think of starting off with dinner at 21?
Will you have perhaps an ambulance downstairs?
Ah, better than that. 21.
You know, Hitchcock obviously had a very complicated relationship with food himself, and here in Rear Window, you have Grace Kelly, one of the most beautiful actresses ever to grace the screen, playing one of the most incredibly idealized females in movie history, and she's having to be seducing James Stewart by demonstrating her ability to provide food to him. And she literally brings almost a restaurant into that apartment to cater to his every whim.
At least you can't say the dinner isn't right.
Lisa, it's perfect. As always.
Stewart's character in Rear Window, like a lot of Hitchcock characters, is rather ambiguous. He's wrong a number of times. He seems to be wrong about Grace Kelly. It's interesting that the biggest close-up that Hitchcock gives Jimmy Stewart is at that moment when she gets finally interested in the murder. And actually when she risks her life and she comes back very excited from having gone over there, he looks at her with tremendous affection at that moment because she's become adventurous and he's kind of an adventurer.
Wasn't that close? What was his reaction? I mean, when he looked at the note.
Well, it wasn't the kind of an expression that would get him a quick loan at the bank.
It's almost as though he's testing her, and she's doing what she does in a way to get his affection.
Isn't Grace Kelly the dominant partner in the relationship? In that film, I mean, she actually does everything. He's basically impotent in the picture.
Pretty well. Oh yeah, she's a very active. He's a typical active New York woman. You know, there are many of those in New York. You know, work for Harper's Bazaar. You know, they're almost like men. Some of these women.
Yeah.
Mr. Hitchcock always discussed the scene with the cameraman first, and he would tell him what lens to use and what he wanted to include in the scene.
Bob Burks was a wonderful talent and a hard-working, lovely man, and he was enjoyable to be around. He'd been with Hitch for several films, of course, and had terrific knowledge of what Hitch required, and he worked very hard, took it very seriously, sometimes too seriously. He would almost get sick over certain shots that he was trying to accomplish for Hitch. But a wonderful man and a very great talent.
The shooting in Jimmy's apartment was very difficult because it was small. It wasn't big, and Hitch never liked to use wide-angle lenses. The lens that Hitch liked to use was a 50 millimeter, and that's about what your eyes see.
Everything we see in that story is told from either James Stewart's point of view, or there's that very dramatic moment where Hitchcock takes the audience into his confidence and says, I am now showing you something that James Stewart, who's asleep, is not seeing. And it lets us get ahead of James Stewart. That's Hitchcock's recipe for suspense, because suddenly now we're going, oh my God, what's going to happen when James Stewart, who up till now has been us, finds out what we know? This is Hitchcock's genius of making us complicit in what's going on.
I always remember Lejeune of The Observer called it a horrible film because a man was looking in windows, you know. It was a crappy remark because who cares, you know, about that kind of thing, because everybody is it's a known fact, you know, that providing you don't make it too vulgar, you know.
The people are
keep it to a point of curiosity. People don't care who you are, cannot resist it.
Gunnison, how did you ever get to be such a big editor with such a small memory?
By thrift, industry, and hard work. And catching the publisher with his secretary.
In the original screenplay, there was a scene in Jimmy Stewart's boss's office. His name was Gunnison. And I didn't think they should ever go away from the Greenwich Village set. And I remember that day that he finished the dictation to John Megal Hayes. We walked into my office, and Mr. Hitchcock said, Mr. Coleman, I think we need to salute the screenplay of Rear Window. And he said, what do you think about the screenplay? And I said, I only have one comment, Mr. Hitchcock. I said, I don't think you should ever go away from the Greenwich Village set. I think that you shouldn't use Gunnison's office. And we discussed it a couple of minutes. It was the last heard of it, until the day we had finished shooting a scene with Jimmy Stewart on the big set in his apartment, and I had sent Jimmy home, and we were moving to the new stage where the Gunnison's office had been built. And Mr. Hitchcock and I were walking together on the way to the new set when he stopped and said, by this time we were now Hitch and Herbie, and he said, Herbie, do you still have the same feeling about Gunnison's office? I said, yes, Hitch, I do, and I don't think you should ever go away from the Greenwich Village set. He said, well, cancel, we won't shoot it. I said, oh, I think we should go ahead and shoot it because the actors are there, the set's been built, and you'll have the dialogue in case you ever want to let the audience hear Gunnison's voice. So we went over and shot the scenes, but we never used in the picture, just Gunnison's voice.
You're too valuable to the magazine for us to play around with. I'll send Morgan or Lambert.
Morgan or Lambert, that's fine. I get myself half killed for you, and you reward me by stealing my assignments.
I didn't ask you to stand in the middle of that automobile racetrack.
I think one of Hitchcock's central concerns is the isolation of people within our society. The apartments reflect the sense that everybody is in a prison.
You've got to get me out of here. 6 weeks sitting in a two-room apartment with nothing to do but look out the window at the neighbors.
Each person is in his or her own little prison. And that all comes to a head, of course, in what I see as the sort of crucial scene of the film, from this point of view anyway. The scene where the woman comes out on her balcony and sees her dog has been killed and accuses all the neighbors.
You don't know the meaning of the word neighbor. Neighbors like each other, speak to each other, care if anybody lives or dies, but none of you do. But I couldn't imagine any of you being so low that you'd kill a little helpless, friendly dog. The only thing in this whole neighborhood who liked anybody.
It's a kind of central statement, I think, in Hitchcock, is this whole idea of people not being able to reach out.
You think of several films of his which were very limited in terms of the location. Rope all plays in one apartment. Lifeboat all plays in a lifeboat. Dial M for Murder, basically with very few exceptions, plays in the London flat of Grace Kelly and Ray Milland. Rear Window all plays in Jimmy Stewart's room. Of course, there is a whole world going on out there, and you see a part of the street, which, just a little bit of part of the street. But he really doesn't go out there into the courtyard once or twice, but always in long shot, or certainly wide shots. Even when the dog is killed, when he does cut a little bit closer. So he liked to limit himself in that way.
In Rear Window, Hitchcock uses very sparing, precise sounds and music to create the sounds and atmosphere of the world in which that story takes place, a world that is defined by that courtyard.
You basically had no score. The only music was when somebody was playing music across the way. Somebody was listening to a record, and you'd hear it. Or somebody was playing the piano, you'd hear it. But other than that, there was no score, which was a very unusual and, at that time, rather daring soundtrack. It gives a kind of verisimilitude and a sense that nobody's intruding on this, that this is real. And Hitchcock was aware of that.
The interesting thing is how he shot it in order to get the sound quality that he did. I mean, he actually shot live sound from Jimmy Stewart's point of view to capture the distance between the window that Stewart was sitting in and the various apartments across the way. So there's that hollow sound in there, which is pretty genuine.
Rear Window was the last of 4 pictures that Franz Waxman composed scores for Hitchcock films. First was Rebecca in 1940, which was followed by Suspicion in 1941, and then The Parodying Case, and finally Rear Window. And the score comes 2 years after Place in the Sun, which was his Academy Award-winning score, also at Paramount, with his famous saxophone love theme, lush love theme for Elizabeth Taylor. And it was historically today considered one of the first jazz scores. And in a way, Rear Window is a little bit in that idiom. It opens with the jazz, which is supposed to be the streets of Greenwich Village, circa 1950s. There is one cue from A Place in the Sun, the famous Farewell and Frenzy cue, and he re-recorded it for Rear Window. The use of source music was not uncommon in films. In those days, if they used source music, in the case of Rear Window, Paramount's publishing arm, which was famous music, they took a famous or popular song at the time, like That's Amore. So you do hear That's Amore in one scene. So in that sense, a composer was given the company music catalog and said, choose here.
Where's that wonderful music coming from?
The song, Lisa, is an integral part of the development of the story, where a piece is being put together before your very eyes and ears. It begins where a struggling songwriter is trying to find the melody and the harmony and develop something. And throughout the course of the film, he finds this song, which you finally hear full-blown at the end. Miss Lonely Hearts, a very tragic character who is across the courtway from Jimmy Stewart, is inspired by this, and hearing this music actually saves her life.
Mr. Jeffries, the music stopped her.
One of the reasons his movies last as well as they do is not only his technical brilliance, obviously, but it's Hitchcock's humanity, Hitchcock's ability to deal with every man. And Hitchcock finds humanity even in his darkest villains. There's something always sympathetic about his villains. You know, Norman Bates is an incredibly sympathetic character to me, certainly the way that Anthony Perkins portrayed him. And even in Rear Window, where we only know Raymond Burr from peeping through his window from across the courtyard, and we begin to suspect this man, and we ultimately become afraid of him. But at the same time, you find yourself being oddly sympathetic with him and feel that he was trapped in that life over there and driven to what he did.
Look, the wedding ring. Turn out the light, he's seen us.
In that film, we're on Stewart's side all the way through the picture because basically you have made us, the audience, peeping Toms too.
Definitely.
Yeah. But isn't there something rather pathetic about and rather sympathetic about Burr's, the murderer's confrontation at the end, and Stewart doesn't even answer him or anything?
You can't, you know, the poor man, you know, says why, you know. It's the climax of the peeping Tomism, isn't it?
Yes.
Really.
Why did you do it?
Why did you do it? If you hadn't been a peeping Tom, I'd have gotten away with it.
Yeah. But at that point in the film, for the first time, one really says to oneself, you know, well, Stewart's a bit of a bastard.
What do you want from me? Your friend, the girl, could have turned me in. Why didn't she?
You feel a great deal of sympathy for Burr there. He comes in and says, why'd you do that? And then Stewart doesn't even answer him.
They can't. What can he say?
What can he say? It's true. He's really caught, in the sense that he's caught with his pants down for the first time. Isn't
caught with his plaster down.
Can you get me that ring back? No. Tell her to bring it back. I can't. The police have it by now.
I think another of Hitchcock's central concerns is the way in which people build these protective facades around themselves and claim this as their identity. It's a way of defending themselves against the unpredictability and the chaos of life. All the things we don't understand and don't know, not simply in the world, but within ourselves. And Jeffries has this, certainly his job, his camera. Jeffries uses the camera at the end as his protection against Thorwald, the camera being a symbol of his whole existence, of course. And the inadequacy of that becomes clear. The flashes hold Thorwald back, but they don't stop him. They delay it, but they don't stop him.
Soon after the finish of the screenplay, I got worried about the scenes when Raymond Burr comes to kill Jimmy Stewart. And Jimmy Stewart had nothing to protect himself with except flashbulbs. So I decided to have a test with Bob Burks and Hitch there and John Fulton, the special effects head, and a few other people there. I'd get their impression of what Raymond Burr would see when Jimmy Stewart flashed the flashbulb in his face. So I arranged a meeting in the art department, and I had a still man there with flash bulbs, and I had him flash those bulbs in our faces, and then ask everybody what they saw as a result of that flash in their eyes. And we all agreed that we saw a kind of a faint yellow mist, and everybody agreed it just blocked out, this mist just blocked out everything. And we went away, and one day I got a call from John Fulton, he'd like to show this to us. So I got Bob Burks and the people who were going to be involved in this, and I went to see it, and I didn't tell Hitch about it. So I went to see it, and what I saw on the screen I couldn't believe. Floating through the air were rings. They looked to be about an inch wide and like a hoop. And they were all different colors floating through the air. And none of the effect we saw at all. So when it was over, I said to John, I said, I'm not going to let Mr. Hitchcock think that this is the kind of work that John Fulton turns out. We insisted that Mr. Fulton redo the color that came over the faces, and it turned out to be what was finally used, a faint red color.
Laser! Doyle! In Rear Window, where Jimmy Stewart is thrown out of the window at the end, I just photographed that with feet, legs, arms, heads, completely montaged. I also photographed it from a distance, a complete action. There was no comparison between the two, and there never is. You know, barroom fights or whatever they do in westerns when they knock the heavy or the one man knocks another across the table, which breaks. They always break a table in bars, you know.
Or the railing.
Or the railing, whatever it is, you know. They're always shot at a distance, but it's much more effective if it's done in montage, because you involve the audience much more. That's the secret of that type of montage in films.
I've heard the story, I don't know if it's true or not, that when they finished the editing of the picture, they took all the trims and outtakes and just put them all on one reel. That's how few trims there were.
They only shot a scene up to a certain point. Then he would change the angle of the camera and start back maybe a frame or a few frames and start the new scene. And then he would stop and go to another angle. That's the way he shot his pictures. So very simple for the editor.
Sorry, Jeff. I got here as fast as I could.
Oh, Mr. Jeffries, don't let anybody touch him. Get my medical bag from upstairs and come here.
Oh, Lisa, sweetie, if anything had happened to you.
Shut up, Ira.
Gee, I'm proud of you.
What the film eventually moves to at the end is a kind of resolution of the Jeffries-Lisa relationship. A lot of people have found it merely cynical because Lisa, although she's dressed in adventure-type clothes, presumably ready to take off with Jeffries on some expedition, and is reading a book called Beyond the High Himalayas or something like that, puts it aside when she sees he's asleep and picks up Harper's Bazaar. But it seems to me that what Hitchcock is saying there is not exactly cynical, it's realistic. Male and female positions are, within the culture, incompatible, within the culture as it existed then, as to a great extent it exists now. Lisa is showing us at the end that she must retain a certain perspective of her own and interests of her own, that she will not abandon her own interests in life and her own values in life for his, and I think that's wonderful.
The last day of filming on the stage 17 at Paramount on Rear Window really was a very sad day for all of us because, we'd been on that picture for a long, long time, and we'd all become very close friends. I remember when they opened the big doors, and Grace Kelly and Hitch and Bob Burks and I all walked out at the same time, and it was a drizzle, slight rain coming down, and we all stopped and looked back in at the set, and all the lights were going out in the various places on the set until it was complete darkness inside. And Grace said, it's almost like leaving home to leave the stage.
Show's over for tonight. Preview of coming attractions.
A real restoration is gathering together all of the materials that exist on a film throughout the world, going through each of them, and bringing together the best of those elements, both picture and sound, to create a preservation negative, which can in effect take the place of the original camera negative, which is either unusable or parts are unusable.
The project started when we actually acquired the films for Universal in 1984.
This is Jimmy Stewart, and I want to tell you about a very special event. The return of 5
Hitchcock pictures unseen for more than a decade.
And those were Rear Window and Vertigo, The Man Who Knew Too Much, Trouble with Harry, and Rope. We bought the films from the Hitchcock Foundation, actually leased them for a period of 5 years at that time. But it was at that time when Bob and I got together, we realized the horrible state that all these pictures were in, and that if something really wasn't done about them, they were going to be lost forever.
To me, this is Hitchcock at his best.
One of the interesting things about films, especially classic films, is that generally the more important the film, the better the film, the worse condition the original negative and sound elements are going to be in. And Rear Window is no different than many others. Normally on large format films, Spartacus and Lawrence of Arabia and
My Fair Lady and Vertigo,
any film shot in 65 millimeter, all of the original prints were made from the original camera negative. But 4perf 35, which is the way that Rear Window was shot, it's unusual, at least when you get into the 50s and 60s, that they would have used an original camera negative from which to create a number of prints. But to our horror, when we first pulled the original camera negative out on Rear Window, we found that there were 389 release prints made on the camera negative. During the 50s and 60s, before wetgate printing, a lab would put a lacquer on the original negative, and they'd run it, make as many prints as they needed. At which point, when the lacquer began to get scratched, they would remove the lacquer and then re-lacquer it. When that would get scratched, they'd re-lacquer it again. Well, when they removed the lacquer from this reel of Rear Window, they actually stripped away about 40% of the yellow layer. And one of the things that held us up initially was that we had to come up with an entirely new preservation concept of replacing only the yellow layer to an original negative where it was gone. And this was done without computers. And we did it in league with Pacific Title.
One of the things we deal with all the time on these restorations is whether we go for sharpness or color. When you deal with a close-up, such as the entrance of Grace Kelly into the picture, one of the great entrances into a film, we're really trying to deal with sharpness to the nth degree. And this was a particularly difficult shot, and it's the shot where we see her moving toward Jimmy Stewart and then moving into the slow-motion kiss. These are moments that are of such impact in a film that we want to make them as perfect as we can.
And that shot was gone. It was actually gone by 1962 in the film's first reissue, which was actually in dye transfer. And the color is bad in 1962. By the time we got the negative, the yellow layer was 90% gone. We printed the shot, and it came out a wonderful shade of orangey green. And this was why we actually had to take 6 months and work out a way of putting back that yellow layer.
We try to go through camera reports. We look at all of the extras that were in the film. We try and find the set designers. We try and find the publicists who were working on the film, because they had an overview of the picture, at that point, and they also had a lot of information about how it played to the audiences of the day and can give us a real comparison. We talk to the director's assistants. We talk to the director if we can, but it's the last few films we've done, we've unfortunately not had a director to work with. But these are all important not only to this record that we try to keep, but it also addresses the ethical side of doing film restorations, which is, should we change something? Can we change something? Do we have the right to change something? And this gives us an insight into, say, in this case, Hitchcock's point of view on the film.
Let's go down and find out what's buried in the garden.
Why not? I've always wanted to meet Mrs. Thorwald.
We're going to play this to audiences who don't know how it's going to end. And those are the best audiences, because that's when you really see the value of this film, and you really see how these Hitchcock films hold up over the years, from a standpoint of dialogue, from a standpoint of acting, from a standpoint of concept, from a standpoint of directing. They're really pieces of our heritage, and they have to be saved, because what's going to happen to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren? They're not going to be able to see these. And this is why we try to impress on studio executives that they are just the guardians of these films. They're like curators of a museum. Sure, they have to make it pay. Sure, they have to balance their books. Sure, they have to come up with new concepts. But they also have to maintain their libraries. They have to maintain the heritage of the industry.
There are a lot of entities out there today which are using the term restoration as a marketing tool. And it not only damages the concept of film restoration worldwide, but it damages the films and really is shortening the lives of the films that people are saying are restored when in fact they're not, because no one's going to bother to restore them.
It's something that takes a very, very long time to do, the quality of restorations that we do, and to maintain the standards that we've set for ourselves in an industry, by the way, that has no standards. There is no standards whatsoever in the restoration community. This is something that we're trying to address, and it's been very, very difficult.
I wonder if it's ethical to watch a man with binoculars and a long focus lens. Do you suppose it's ethical even if you prove that he didn't commit a crime?
I'm not much on Rear Window ethics.
Rear Window is one of those pictures where you just feel that everything in that movie is perfectly realized, exactly the way that Hitchcock imagined it. And we are able to be, in a sense, caught up in the storytelling on the one hand, but also overwhelmed by its perfection on the other.
The salesman's looking out of his window, you see? Get back. You'll see it.
I'm not shy. I've been looked at before.
It's no ordinary look. It's a kind of a look a man gives when he's afraid somebody might be watching him.
I think Rear Window was a film that he liked and was fond of and proud of. I think Rear Window shows him at the absolute peak of his powers. I think it's also the beginning of his last great period. I think from there on, he just really doesn't make a wrong move.
Somebody said there are two kinds of people in the world. There are people who are, we could call them voyeurs, or anyway, people who observe the world that passes by. And there are people who are active, adventurers who are part of the world. Would you say you were a person who observes?
Observes, sure. Definitely.
So then you must, in a way, identify with Jimmy Stewart's character in Rear Window.
Oh, possibly, yes.
Those are just a few of my neighbors. First, I watched them just to kill time, but then I couldn't take my eyes off them, just as you won't be able to.